Cliff Grossner. I'm with IHS Markit and have the pleasure of chairing the second panel for the day. And quite excited to be here and share time with everyone. I'd like to invite our panel members to come on up and join me. So please come on up and take the stage. And we're going to be talking a little bit about a favorite subject of mine, open source. Being a computer scientist by training and actually having the luck or bad luck to have worked on AI technology just as we went into the winter for AI many, many years ago, as one of those graduate students that burnt a lot of researching money without necessarily producing a result way back in the day, working on some of the early open source systems in AI, such as a rule-based system called CLIPS that was based on work at NASA, and also working with some of the earliest neural network simulators. And today we have with us a pretty illustrious panel that I want to have a very frank discussion about innovation in Canada. And for me, being later in my career, it's very important that we take the next step with places like Cengn to put Canada on the map in a very focused way as a world leader in certain technologies. And it's not for me to decide which ones, but I do have certain strong opinions. So with me today on the panel, I have to put my glasses on, I apologize, is Christian Spielvogel from Mitel, and Ron Barrow, Stephen Finn from Knockland, Ron is from Wind River, and Tamer Shanuda, hope I got that right. Tamer Shanuda from Bell Canada. And to lead it off, I have a few, actually maybe we'll change the order, and why don't I let you introduce yourselves and give us your point of view, and then I have a few charts that I think are coming up after this one. So why don't you go ahead and take a minute or so and introduce yourselves, and if you have a point of view that you want to share with us about the subject today, how we're going to drive open cloud innovation, and I think a lot of subject discussions around open source software. Go ahead. I'll leave you to choose the order.
All right, I'll go. So welcome, everybody. I'm Tamer Shanuda, Director of Network Transformation at Bell. So at Bell, we've started our journey of a transformation initiative called Network 3.0. Some of you may have heard. And it's really about transforming our people, process, and technology. And within my team, I have a team of end-to-end architects that look at our kind of end-to-end vision for where our networks are going to go and driving some of that innovation through proof of concepts and different innovation strategies that we have. I also have a team that delivers our network service orchestration platform that's based on ONAP, so one of the larger open source projects out there. So really happy to be here because innovation is the heart of everything we do in my team. So looking forward for this conversation.
Thank you, Tamer. Hello, everyone. My name is Ron Barrow. I'm a Director of Business Development at Wind River Systems here in Canada. And unlike some of the questions I've had, Wind River is a software company. We don't actually make that cool line of men's clothing and whatnot that's available. We're a software company, part of Intel. And I myself work on a software product called Titanium Cloud, which is a family of virtualization platforms for critical infrastructure applications, such as networking, communications, and industrial applications. And Wind River actually joined Cengn in May of 2016, so it's been a little while now. Looking about myself, in my career I've worn many hats. I've been a software designer, I've been a design manager, I've been an architect, and most recently a PLM. And I would say the one theme that has been more or less consistent in my career has been the growing use of open source technologies. And just as some examples, in the late 1990s, I led a team at Nortel which introduced the first commercial product in the company that was using Linux as a base operating system. And that was seen as an outrageous decision at the time to use Linux. And it required a lot of I guess you'd say upstream paddling to get that through. But we were successful, and ultimately the whole industry was changing at that time. And Ever since then, I would say every product that I've worked on has also been based on Linux. So a lot of change. Along the way, other open source has worked its way into my products and my projects as well. Things such as Apache, MySQL, OpenSSL, and of course more recently, the products that we think of associated with the drive into the cloud, KVM, OpenStack, OpenDaylight, OpenSSL, sorry, I meant to say OpenFlow. So just a lot of commonality there. And in my opinion, just laying it out there, I believe that the products that we develop using open source are developed more quickly with more features and at less cost than if they had been developed using 100% proprietary code. So a large advantage. Looking forward, I think that if Canada wants to continue to be a leader in the global R&D community, that we need to continue to draw from and, importantly, contribute to open source projects. And I think that needs to be a core foundation in our work. Thank you.
Ron, I gotta go fast, apparently. Good thing I'm from Newfoundland. So I'm a founder of a startup in Newfoundland called Knockland. We do 24/7 network operations center as a service, pretty much to service providers and their downstream clients. The interesting thing about Knockland, we're actually doing a project with Cengn now, and we built our software inside of AWS. But we're seeing with OpenStack, Open Network Function Virtualization, that it's a great opportunity for us to jump into this open cloud ecosystem and look at ways to turn up, just basically put our NMS software and being able to deploy inside that OpenStack environment. And we're very happy with the projects we're doing now with Cengn, and looking forward to continuing.
Okay, and I think Christian would be the next chart.
Okay. So yeah, my name is Christian Spilfo. I'm responsible for strategy in the contact center business unit at Mitel. Speaking of Canadian companies, Mitel's actually done extremely well over the last 15, 16 years in particular. When we were basically cast off by Zarlink in 2000, we were at about a $450 million business. You might be surprised to know, especially if you haven't been paying attention, that we're now about a $1.3 billion business. Out of that, what's interesting is people often think of us as the old stodgy PBX company, and we certainly sell a lot of that stuff. I don't want to say that we don't. But we've actually transformed into a SaaS company. We started that journey about 7 years ago. We have just over $300 million now of revenue in unified communications as a service deployments. And we are number 2 on a global basis in that particular market with only about 0.5 percentage points market share behind RingCentral, who a lot of people seem to know a little bit better. So the perspective I bring to this panel is a little bit different than the rest of the team here. We obviously are an application company. We don't make infrastructure. We build on top of the infrastructure, and that'll be the nature of the answers that I give today.
Okay, and I think I did have a few prepared slides. I'm not sure if someone can flip them up. Perfect. And so when I thought about what I would do to lead off the discussion today, and then of course we'll have some questions from the panel, and I'll try to open up the floor for questions. We have our full hour, and we're still got 51 minutes left, so we're in good shape. I thought what I would do is, because we're talking about cloud, and there's so many telecom people in the industry, that I would talk about telco cloud a little bit more than data center, but the questioning shouldn't, and the answers will not be limited to telco cloud, and we'll talk about not only open source, but potentially open networking, which means open hardware as well, so we can go anywhere we'd like to go. So when it comes to telco cloud, what I wanted to do was share with you a little bit about the roadmap, and at IHS Markit, we've been following the transition to telco cloud since its inception for more than 5 to 7 years now. We were one of the early participants at the SDN World Congress, where perhaps the whole concept was born, and we've had lots of interactions with the original ETSI founders who wrote the white papers that Telco NFV is all based upon. and we've been following that market very closely. We've also had a lot of people ask us recently, what's going on with this market? We've been at it 5 years and not much has happened. And I keep saying to everyone, yeah, but if you look at the same revolution that happened in the data center world, it took 10. So let's be patient. We're actually well on the way, and we have already a significant amount of revenue can be attributed to SDN and NFV. Now, I will show you a few numbers in a moment, but what I wanted to also show you here is our roadmap for what we see happening. And we believe 2017 and 2018 is the year where products finally mature enough that we start to see the market take off. We see the open source stacks that can now be potentially deployed by telcos, and we see in our discussions with telcos that they're no longer scratching their head going, gee, what do I do with this open source thing? They've kind of made a decision about how that's going to work for them in their ecosystems. So I think that's also very important progress in the market. And also, we had a lot of delays because telcos, as they realized they wanted to deploy NFV, figured out that they had to look at their OSS, BSS systems, and those needed work as well. So it wasn't just a matter of we're going to rethink the network, we had to rethink everything. And moving forward, what we see happening in the next year or 2 years, 2018, 2019, it's really about people and processes. How do we take the telco of yesterday, where perhaps the CTO shop now is running in an NFV and SDN mode, and in an open source and software-oriented innovation cycle, but the operational people have not yet had a chance to catch up. So how do we move that part of the business when we get ramped deployments? And the other thing is going to be the question about AI technologies and how are they going to change things. So I want to come back to the question I get asked, oh, come on, is NFV ever really going to happen? And you know, what I would say if I was going to be flippant, and I will be for a second, there's no choice. If the telcos do not do NFV, 5G is Google. That's it. They can close the light. They can close the shop. But thank heavens, in our surveys, where we surveyed service providers that represent 61% of the CapEx spend in the world, 100% said, no doubt, we're doing SDN and we're doing NFV. And it's happening now. So they've definitely got to that point where we're going to see lots of progress. Another thing that's also very important when it comes to open cloud or innovation and things that we have to think about is how Canada's going to play is telco cloud is going to be highly distributed. We're going to be computing across centralized data centers, regional data centers, central office data centers, and at the customer premise equipment on some devices that people now are calling universal customer premise equipment, or uCPE. And so any software we design is going to have to be designed for a highly distributed environment where it can be managed across that distribution. And that's a challenge where I think we have a place where we can bring our technology and our know-how to bear, something we should think about. Now, I'm going to put a number on the table, and this is not the $105 billion that you saw earlier. My apologies. This is SDN in the data center, and we have that at $18 billion by 2021. We track SDN and NFV as 3 separate markets. The other markets that we track are SDN in the carrier network, and going from my mind, that's about $12 billion for 2021. And we also put NFV at $37 billion. Now, if you do the math, it's still not 105. And all I'll say is probably the differences are in how we define, how we count the market. And I'll leave it at that. But we're very comfortable with our counting of the market. Now, the big message here for me is the blue square at the top, which is the SDN controller software and applications, which is where I think that's the next round of innovation going to come. I think this is one of the last charts that I had, and I'm just about done on my time. I wanted to share with you our projections for white box switching, or open networking, if you like, in the data center, which includes both the white box shipments from Taiwan, plus switches that are shipped by the likes of Dell and HPE, which have a choice of operating system on them with support. Potentially in the future, some of those will include barefoot type programmable silicon And we're already seeing these switches come with Cavium-type programmable silicon, which is not quite the same as barefoot, but still a step in an interesting direction. And we have that at near 25% of all white box switches shipped into the data center by 2021. And actually, our forecast has been pretty solid on that. And we're in discussions with many of the vendors out of Taiwan. I visit them once a year, and they do share under the covers some of the results they're getting. I'm going to leave you with a final chart. So I have to come back to AI. And I think that we're going to be seeing a totally new world for compute. And I think one of the things that we mustn't lose sight of is that a lot of people have said, oh, compute's going to be generic, it's going to be cheap servers, no differentiation. Not true. That's not where that world is going. With the need for parallel compute, I just was at SC17, that's Supercomputing 17, and there's a whole range of compute hardware that's designed for parallel compute, the fundamental underpinning needed to do machine learning and AI. And so as we do telco cloud, we should not be thinking that servers are generic. We have to move past that thinking and look at having a pool of resources that's for compute based upon the workload we need. And that's the next optimization. I'm going to leave you with 3 thoughts before we open it. One is telco cloud will happen. 2, open networking is a certainty. 25% of ports shipped into the data center. Open networking by 2021. We're pretty comfortable with that. And look out for differentiated compute, not generic compute. So with that, we've already introduced the panel. I think I need to go to the last chart, and we can start with the questions. Okay, so I do have an opening question for the panel. And I got to look it up. Sorry about that. I'd like to get your perspective on what are the top 3 technologies that Canada should focus on, because we can't do it all. We are more than 30 billion people, but we're not 300 billion or 300 million. And we need to pick our bets in Canada. What would you say they should be? I'm opening it up to the panel.
One of the things that I would start with, and this draws on my own heritage, communications, sharing of data is a core theme for many of us in this room. And certainly as I look forward, the opportunities to continue to innovate in this area are continuing to grow and really explode. If you look at some of the things we heard about this morning with IoT, with smart cities, with intelligent machine learning. All of those things require some form of connectivity and communications. And there are many people in Canada who have a great history of innovating, creating patents, valuable patent portfolios, that I think if we have the right infrastructure, the right supports, we can continue to really drive that, draw on the things that we've learned already, like how to build reliable networks, how to ensure that there is carrier grade in the system. Make use of that, build it in, and share what we can with the world to enable further innovation.
So I hear networking is one. Does anyone else want to offer up another one or support that position or negate it?
Well, I would add, I mean, there's actually a lot of good areas, right? But just to build on the networking piece, even though we've had a couple of companies supernova over the last 15 years, the reality is that when you take a look at it, and I spent a lot of time out of the country, right? Canada is recognized for its networking prowess and skills. And when people are thinking about who do they need to hire, where do they need to hire when it comes to those skills, Canada is always on the top 5 list of countries to look at. And there's little things that we don't appreciate how much we've actually innovated in the communication space. And I'm talking more than just voice, right? We've innovated a lot on the world stage. Now, does anybody who here knew that we had the 25th anniversary of the first text message, right, this week? Okay, how many people knew that was a Canadian invention? Right, 4 or 5 people. These are the things we need to be proud of. We're really very talented at coming up with new technology. That first text message was created by a company called Airwide out of Montreal. The first text message was sent to a person in Vodafone, right, in the UK. And now the question is, do you know what the first message was? What was the first text message? Merry Christmas. Perfect, exactly. So that's just an example of messaging, voice. You know, you talked about IoT. We take a look at smart cars, and you think about, you know, the necessity of communication in everything you do, whether it's connectivity of devices, communication with people. And even though our children are text messaging most of the time or IMing most of the time, right, it's still communication. So it is an absolute strength that we have, right? I could go on, but I'll let someone else speak for
Okay, so we have 2 votes, networking and communication. That's where we make our bet. Anybody else? Somewhere else? Same place?
I think I look at it a little differently in that another place that Canada is becoming very strong is the whole AI component, machine learning, and I think we have a lot of strengths. And I'm going to give you a non-center of the country view. Like for instance, one thing that back to your IoT and such, like we're working with a joint venture now in Atlantic Canada and creating Smart Ocean, similar to Smart Cities. So we have all these different technologies, different things that are, you know, we're good at, you know, whether it's fisheries or up north, climate change, and applying that technology, those techniques in those different industries, coupled with IoT, I think could be a very strong way to strengthen what our current strengths are.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear someone wants a second pillar. I'm a firm believer, as a country, we need 3. So what would the third pillar be?
I'll build a third pillar on top of the first 2.
All right.
Excellent.
Cheating.
Yeah, I am cheating. That was actually my thought here is linking AI to networking. We heard this morning that there's a lot of challenges, and actually in your presentation as well, the fact that the virtualized network is going to be at a distributed scale that's hard to imagine operating manually, actually impossible. I think the orchestration of that and the automation of that network needs to go through some form of AI, some form of machine learning. And I think those 2 things combined is actually where the key differentiator and the key success factor in actually virtualizing our large-scale networks starts from. So I would definitely be interested in getting more schools to pump out students that have both software engineering and networking engineering skills to help us build that new technology that's required.
So perhaps also some people walking out of school being able to use TensorFlow as well in the network.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, one other thought, perhaps. It occurs to me that, and not shockingly, security really needs to be an area that we put a lot of focus in the future. And I don't know if necessarily Canada has any specific expertise in this area, but we have the right intelligence and the right academia to support that. And there is a huge need in industry for security across all levels. As we, you know, continue to connect, continue to share, we need to have continuous automated security.
And I can tell you that from our research that security is going to see huge revenue dollars in the next 10 years. So it looks like we have 3 good pillars. We have AI, networking, and security. I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I'll throw 4th in there just
All right.
just so that we have a +1, right? You
I
always
like
have
diversity. That's great.
You have to hedge your strategies. Right? So another area that's really evolving and where Canada has a huge opportunity to play is in not so much the software as a service piece, but at a layer down from that in terms of a technology referred to commonly as microservices type deployments. Some people refer to it as API technology. There's a huge change and transformation going on in the cloud world right now. It's still the Wild West, right? We have the skills and the brain power in order to be able to capitalize on that. And it's an area where there is no clear winner at the moment, but it is an area where if you look 15, 20 years from now, it will be considered the de facto technology in the older base of technology, in fact, at that point. So this is another area that I think we need to spend quite a bit of energy intellectually.
I like that. I think that's a very modern, forward-looking view. One of the areas that we research is cloud services. And one of the first things I hear about is the issues dealing with Google's API versus Amazon's APIs versus the other APIs. And if we're going to truly build a multi-cloud, how are we going to get past that? Well, that's going to be ultimately also very important. I want to ask the same question, but from a different slant now, because we've all talked about how we can be strong in technology. We've already identified a strategic direction for the country. Hopefully the Prime Minister will listen to what we have to say, but I think we're headed in the right direction. The other thing that I want to bite off is a harder one for Canadians. That is, how do we build companies that become leaders on the world stage, not just technology? And it's an area where, on a personal level, I feel we can do way better than we have. And hopefully we can provide some insights and start an ecosystem that can help do that. I myself travel more than 100,000 miles a year in airplanes, so I've seen lots of other bustling technology innovation, commercialization innovation centers. And I want to open it up to the panel. How do we make Canada not only a technology innovator, but a commercialization innovator and commercialization leader, and a commercial success in the world?
I think there are a lot of opportunities to commercialize the technologies we've been talking about today. In particular, as I look across at some of the open source technologies that we use and build on, they're great. They really provide you with the ability to jump forward, introduce new capabilities, but there are times where they're lacking. They're not quite ready for prime time, for wide-scale development or deployment. And I think there's great commercialization opportunities around the services, the hardening of some of these technologies. There are companies who are eager to roll out and consume these services, but they don't necessarily have the depth or the skills or the scale to be able to do what it takes. So I think the right companies can step in and can fill that gap and create a business for themselves while at the same time, helping others. So I think there's a lot of space for that there.
And to build on that, I think there's two other ways where open source actually can help create commercialization and create innovation as well. So you talked about kind of hardening and giving training and support and an ecosystem around that. Some companies also, as we heard this morning in the IBM AI space, are really good at stitching different open source initiatives together to come up with a value add, to come up with a new differentiator as well. So that's another avenue companies can take. And a third one is, when I look at ONAP specifically, because this is my area of concern, people ask sometimes, how can we actually get into this space without losing what we have and with creating value? And there's opportunities to actually create satellite functions around open source initiatives that can be commercial, closed source if necessary, but that can actually add value. So when we're thinking about ONAP, there's opportunities for creating inventory systems or billing systems that are next generation, that deal with usage-based billing and application purchases live and all these new functions that are not integrated in the core platform. So open source can be a platform for these satellite innovation opportunities for small companies to start participating in the greater ecosystem.
I'll take a completely different angle here, right, and go back to the saying that it takes a village to raise a child, and it takes a nation to help build companies. A lot of it revolves around policy. If you take a look at international companies and they say, okay, if I'm going to be hiring people within Canada, what's the number one thing that I'm going to hire them for? Innovation and technology. When it comes to sales and marketing, they'll look to other countries. And there's reasons for that. We've done a very good job at a federal and provincial level to be able to innovate or to incent innovation through things like SHRED, IRAP, et cetera. There's excellent programs in place to allow young companies to innovate and create. But one of the things that we don't do particularly well in Canada is around the education of our people in terms of creating good commercialization techniques. So that's an area of policy that I think we absolutely need to take a look at, is so that we can truly take companies from being, great to awesome. The other piece I think that's necessary here is also investment. If we take a look at it from who purchases. So, most of these companies here, with potentially the exception of Bell, who's done very well within Canada, it's their primary footprint, we're much more successful in selling to foreign governments than we are to our own governments. And this too needs to be part of our, policy in terms of making sure that we support the technologies and the companies that we have within our country in order to be able to export. And the third element is funding and financing. So if you take a look at a lot of young companies, we have the necessary angels, VCs, et cetera, to take the companies to probably about $200 to $300 million. Now, a $200 to $300 million company is barely an international company in reality. In order for that company to be able to go over $1 billion, it takes a fair bit of capital investment. And I can tell you, as a company that started at about $450 million to take it to $1.3 billion, it is really tough to do it on Canadian-based investments. So there's an aspect here, and I would suggest, again, it's a policy discussion that we have to find ways of encouraging investors and large-scale investors to be able to look within Canada and be Canadians that are being able to invest in these and give the necessary incentives to take a number of the smaller companies that are in here and take you to, the true global stage.
Well, thank you. Actually, you've put your foot right on a pet peeve of mine, and I'm really happy you said it, as I was going to say it if the panel didn't mention it. I have to ask the question, why does a 50 or 100-person Canadian company have to go down to the US to get a PR firm so they can get good press?
Correct.
For the most part? Sorry. And for the most part, go get someone from marketing out of the US to deliver the message for them. And to me, that starts right at the beginning, right? Creating that ecosystem of marketing and commercialization experts, just like we invest in our policy to build innovators or inventors.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very important one.
Probably not unique to our industry as well. I've heard similar comments made. I think there could be something endemic in being Canadian that we always look elsewhere, unfortunately.
I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
I think it's a Canadian issue, not a telecom issue.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, my comment was generically. It was Canadian companies in general. Yeah.
Interesting enough, it's also a provincial issue. We could not sell to, we just signed our first customer in Atlantic Canada. If it wasn't for Ontario companies, we wouldn't have got off the ground.
Well, and that's right. I don't know what size, unfortunately, I'll admit my ignorance, but perhaps it's what I found is at a certain size, that's when you get forced externally. Yeah. Okay, well, let's take it to the next level, because I think we hit on some really important advice for the audience. And while I don't know what lever to pull to change policy, I wish I did, but at least it's been put out there. I want to come back to a topic that Christian mentioned, the API economy. And I think a lot of people here may not know what we mean when we talk about the API economy. And I'll be frank, I don't have a good definition, so I'm going to open it up to the panel and say, what is an API economy? How would I recognize it if I saw it?
Do you want me to start, or did you want to go for it?
Anyone who feels passionate.
Oh, I'm passionate about this one. Yeah, I'm passionate about this one. This is kind of what I was alluding to earlier as the new frontier of what's going on. So a lot of the technology, I like a phrase, and I wish I could remember who said it, right? But a guy said, any cloud built prior to 2010 is called legacy cloud now. Right? A lot of people still trying to wonder if this cloud thing is for real, right? So we've already moved on to a next generation of cloud. You take a look at companies such as Netflix, Uber, et cetera. The way they build now is not the way it was built before. They're not building a monolithic application. They're building a series of very small applications that all cooperatively work together. The interesting thing, too, is they don't have their own infrastructure. That's very interesting. So there's a whole series of developments that are happening now, which are creation of smaller, well-targeted applications that solve individual needs. Those applications, then, you can kind of view them as like a micro-competition, et cetera. So the days of large monolithic applications is basically eroding. Now, as you build these smaller applications, those applications then become consumable by others. So if somebody was building an application today, and I know there's a lot of young companies here that are building good SaaS applications, if you went for a multi-factor authentication capability, you might not build that yourself. There's hundreds of them out there that you can access, right? They're from all over the world, and you can get exactly what you want. The only reason you would build it yourself is because it might actually be too hard to select out of 100 of these things.
Terrible problem.
Yeah, it's a terrible problem to have. So the point is that there's this evolution now where innovation can happen on very small levels, creation of applications where your entire world, the entire world is your open market, where you can take technology, build on it, and create new applications and new innovations. And you can do it at 10 times the speed, and that's measured, 10 times the speed of the old way of doing things. So this whole changeover in the technology becomes really very interesting in terms of the possibilities in new innovation within Canada, for sure.
Anyone else want to wade into that? Interesting topic.
I think it was well said. Breaking down big problems into small problems and enabling smaller players to actually address those individual problems or subsets of them.
Yeah, and I see it as being a huge enabler for, I think we saw the term earlier, value creation. So many different services, applications as a consumer that I can access today are there because they are using the underlying infrastructures of other small companies. They are using APIs. Example, you may want to do a backup of your system at home. At one point in time, you used to buy a certain amount of storage space, and it would come with an application. Today, you purchase an application, and you can choose Google storage, you can choose AWS storage, all enabled through this type of economy.
It's a good point. I mean, a lot of people here, especially right now with things like Google Home, with Amazon Alexa, et cetera, right? These are great examples of how the API economy is enabling things right away. I got a Google Home just the other day, right, to play with, and I got an Amazon Echo because I want to compare the two at the same time. But to set up my automated lights, to set up a tie-in with my Honeywell thermostat, to tie in with my door locks, and the rest of the stuff was absolutely trivial because of the API aspects of this stuff. These companies aren't related at all, right?
And so is it important for Canada to be part of this somehow, and how do we leverage it? What do we do?
It is. As I said, it's kind of like the Wild West right now. Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen around this, what it's going to look like in 5 years or 10 years from now. A lot of people appear to be dominating, right? So you get guys like AWS who were pioneers in this space, to be fair, and they're offering an awful lot of these services. So there's a whole infrastructure evolution that's going on. But this is just not even 1% of the possibilities of what's happening and what's going on right now. So Canada being very innovative, and as we talked about earlier, we do have very strong support from our governments in terms of technology evolution. We have some issues with commercialization, as we talked about, but we have the necessary tools to take that, Wild West, if you will, and make something really phenomenal from a country perspective. And one of the nice things about the API economy is it knows no borders, right? It doesn't matter whether you can extend a wire right across the border. It doesn't matter whether you have regulatory approval, right? I can create a service and I can have somebody in Stockholm consume it. I can have somebody in Dubai consume it. I can have somebody in South Africa consume it. Can you imagine how big a market that is when you don't have constraints of that nature and where you can create small amounts of value very quickly that generate a lot of money? There's huge opportunity here.
If I could, the way you described that just made me think of something. When you look at geographic boundaries, increasingly that's becoming more important to some people, where, for example, their data is stored, what paths their communications take. And as Canadians, I think we have a lot to offer in terms of having services that are stored or managed in Canada, where their Canadian laws are overseeing the aspects of that data and how it's used and who has access to it, and privacy. So I think that in itself just being part of a different geographic area can introduce some opportunities with the API economy too.
Well, you're right, but it's a short-term tactical thing, okay? Because the reality is that data doesn't really know borders. And even though people have a concern around data sovereignty, and we certainly see the rise of GDPR in Europe, for example, and the United States is seeing an evolution, they'll eventually have to copy a GDPR-type policy. Canada's already got one in the works. Here's the reality. If you build a company here in Canada and you want to protect your data here, if you do business in the United States, just to take a neighborly example, and that business matters to you, if they then compel you to take the data that you have for your company, which is in Canada, and make it available for a court process, right? You have a choice, right? Because they can actually stop you from selling in the United States. So you have a choice: give up your data, right? Or stop doing business in the United States through an injunction. So these things are kind of transient, if you will. But the rise of good policies, such as GDPR in Europe, I think help to foster the good level of security. But you're right in the sense that for the next 5 to 10 years, it is very much a concern for a lot of companies, particularly government entities, where they have an obligation. You may not realize this, but some of our governments actually already are keeping our data outside of the country. So if you have a hunting and fishing license, for example, that's all processed in Nashville.
Huh. So. Interesting. So we have about 20 minutes left. I have a couple more questions for the panel. I think we'll tackle one more and then see if there's questions in the audience, and then we can go from there. I think the one question that I would like to ask the audience, the panel, is how are we going to grow our talent base? We talked about AI, we talked about communications, we talked about the API economy. What are the things we need to invest in to grow our talent base? How do we do that? Whether it's open source technologies or whatever we decide to invest in. What should be the priorities for Canada?
I think one thing is, for me, is focus. So you just mentioned AI. One of the good examples is what's happening in Montreal right now, the kind of innovation hub that's starting around AI. And it started really by the fact that there was a large concentration of AI and machine learning researchers that came together in that forum, and one of them is a superstar now, and attracted a lot of government funding around that, and then that in consequence brought Microsoft and Google and IBM to the play. So that created a really big momentum in that area and brought other experts as well in. So I think if we can create these other innovation poles or hubs in various cities and create momentum around a specific focus topic, that's really the way to create a lot more of a talent pool that we need.
That makes perfect sense to me. Anybody else?
I'd say that there's, reusing a phrase, some policy things that can be done. Certainly, our federal government has been supportive in the past of scholarships in universities, NSERT as an example. Perhaps focusing those in certain areas, such as AI, having fellowships associated with it. There are ways even of perhaps Canadian content associated with some of our developments, looking to use that. Increased use of open source within the federal government, having perhaps mandate for a certain amount of that. So I think there are things that could be done to spur investments in those areas. It will automatically draw the talent to work with it, and it will self-perpetuate.
And our currency doesn't hurt right now, actually, right? Unless you're leaving the country to go on vacation. But we're actually relatively inexpensive for the relative level of talent that we have. So productivity by dollar is very high in Canada. And then when you take into account the various tax credits that we get, certainly here in Ontario, we have a very strong, there's very strong reasons for people to want to hire and drive innovation here. We've got other provinces such as New Brunswick, which are actually even better, right? So just to give you an example, we have a large team in India. Not a surprise. Very talented people that have, we have a lot of resources to draw from. Did you know it's not actually cheaper to do it in India than New Brunswick? New Brunswick is just about the same amount of price. And the skills are in an adjacent time zone. Very talented pool with universities such as UNB, right, putting out good skills. So we do have a lot of strong foundation, and I agree with you in terms of from a policy perspective, we're doing a lot of the right things, and yeah, we just need to focus now on the key things that are going to take us forward in a country. Perhaps it's the 3 pillars that have been proposed here,
Right.
versus a lot of the legacy innovations that have been done.
Right, so focused energy on certain areas where we're going to encourage
Yeah.
innovation and people to invest themselves and grow talent is the way we want to go. No one mentioned being as open as we can to bring in the best and brightest to come here and work in Canada.
Isn't that a given? I
We
mean, we
do
do
that
a good
already.
job of that. So.
Yeah, oh, we do, okay. In fact, in my travels, whenever someone says, warning about where to make a life, I say, you know what, think about Canada. Good place to live. You can afford a house, and we have a reasonable immigration policy. Okay.
I just want to point to that, and I do think education is
Sorry.
the key.
Yeah.
I heard somewhere, and I going around listening to all these data science podcasts and stuff all the time, and I know, like, I heard some statistics that it was comparing, I think, high school, 5% of U.S. Students learn programming in school, and somewhere like 95% in China. And I just think the interesting thing about that for me is you know, when I listen to all these machine learning and data science podcasts, that's an industry that's really, really just starting to, those tools are just being created, and it's becoming less of the know-how of that person, and that's going to be, you know, those are hand saws that are turning into, you know, table saws. You know?
Absolutely.
And those tools are, so those shouldn't, I don't think we should be focusing on someone who has a computer science degree. Computer science and engineers as the people who are going to use these tools. This should be a very broad thing.
Yeah.
How does a nurse use machine learning, right?
Make Python the 3rd official language, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I really like that theme, actually, where you're going, and I agree with everything you said there. And a pet peeve of mine has actually been, there's another angle here, and it goes back to the commercialization thing. We don't do enough in our education system in order to spur innovation, right? Get people thinking around entrepreneurship, creating businesses, right, as opposed to working for somebody. Entrepreneurship is a key way that we fundamentally generate, you know, a better gross domestic product, if you will. If you look at it from a Canadian selfish perspective, right, we need this. And I'm very encouraged by seeing some new foundations opening up, such as, you know, Terry Matthews, local key entrepreneur in the area, has started a foundation called the Alacrity Foundation, which some of you may be aware of. And there it takes a lot of private money, et cetera, in order to, and some public money as well, in order to create an environment that's an incubator type environment where you take people that have entrepreneurial abilities and then you educate them in terms of how to truly be an entrepreneur and create your own business. And, you know, as I listened to that, you know, it struck me as, you know, interesting to say that we had to create this shim, if you will, going into industry in order to be able to get people to become entrepreneurs and to learn the necessary skills. And we really should be learning that much earlier in our education process. And, you know, this goes back to, you know, again, policy, if you will. But this is an area where if you go to, my wife is from Hong Kong, okay? And if you're in Hong Kong, the entire environment is about wanting to start a business, right? If you're not someone who's thinking about creating a business, you're kind of, it's like, oh, that's interesting. You want to work for somebody? Okay. But it's a cultural thing that's really important, right? It starts very early on. Here in Canada, we don't get that level of spark, if you will, even though we have the people to do it. So that's an angle that I think we really need to, as a country, to start to change.
I'm supposed to be impartial, but I'm not impartial. I totally agree with you, and I've seen it in my travels as well. So there's 11 minutes left, and in all fairness, we should give the audience who must be interested in asking a question or two, I imagine. So if someone would like to ask a question, there's some microphones, I believe, in circulation, or someone coming up to you. So go right ahead, please.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Michael. I'm a professor at Algonquin College, and I'm trying to get a clear message from what you said. I'm hearing we need to encourage and foster entrepreneurship, so we'd better never go work for the big companies like Bell Canada. So then the other thing I'm hearing is we need to encourage innovation and entrepreneurship, and yet I'm hearing that all of these companies are going to need a whole boatload of talent to, in fact, create this innovation in Canada. So where is the happy medium between linking private industry with the educational institutions that will create a great talent pool for Bell and Mitel and all these larger companies, and yet foster innovation? I don't want to work for you. I'm going to go somewhere else, my own company. I don't know if that question is clear.
I think it's great,
it is.
actually.
Yeah, it's a great question, actually, and it's one of the things that, if you take a look at what's happening in the new business models that are occurring right now, nobody can go it alone anymore. It's impossible. So there's no way that Bell can do this on their own. There's no way that Mitel can do this on its own. It necessitates innovation and people to create new value that we can then either license, partner, even acquire, in that respect. So these aren't contradictions, right? So I would rather, right, that if there's 10 people in the room, I'd rather them all go and try and create their own business and generate value, because they're going to be way faster and way smarter than we can do it.
Yeah.
But then I can leverage that technology.
Yeah, and I want to add to that. Absolutely agree with what you just said, and it's actually the direction we're kind of all going in the industry. If you look at the SDN and FV kind of portfolio and where that's going, a lot of the innovation is coming through open source and open communities and open platforms. I'm going to plug in ONAP one more time. I think what we're trying to create here is an ability for these small players to come in and actually solve these problems at the different scales. So we see small players, medium players, large players, building kind of the infrastructure physically that you need to span across, thousands of kilometers. You need some form of large corporation to do that. But then all of the innovation that rides on top of it, I think that's where that larger ecosystem with many, many players, especially Canadian players that can innovate in this space, is something that we really want to foster and get going. So absolutely also see it as non-contradictory, actually very complementary to our strategy.
And I think if we were to pick on operators, maybe we have a certain mindset in our heads about the speed at which they move, but at least in my company at Wind River, we work with a lot of different operators, and the world is just rapidly changing. We're all aware of that, but they are changing at rates that are shocking in some cases. Adopting new technologies, using some of the latest cutting-edge systems to deploy applications, to spin up new services. We heard earlier about some of the competitive pressures coming through companies like Google and others. And I think some of that is also driving those sorts of changes and the changes in behaviors. And the people who have the skill sets that can help them will be equally welcome in those companies as with some of the smaller ones as well.
And just personally, from my experience, I spent 15 years, never really moved my desk, but I went through 5 mergers and acquisitions and ended up at Rogers at the end of the day. That's when I left, by the way, so don't worry. But the interesting thing is that's when you learn the problems that they have. And that's when you can go out and innovate and create something and bring it back as either a product or, service to them.
True.
So I think I'd like to try to come back with what I heard with a direct response to you, which is it becomes the role of the large company working with the educators to create the ecosystem of small players that are out there trying the new things. And that's what then creates the ecosystem that either becomes the next billion-dollar company or gets acquired by a bigger company, but then that innovation lives on in the new company. And I think that that's the gestation process that if I look at the Berkeley, Stanford dipole and the Silicon Valley environment, that's very alive there. And I don't know why we can't, in Canada, create the Waterloo, University of Toronto, University of Ottawa, Carleton,
Queens.
like whatever.
Algonquin.
Dipole, tripole, whatever, but get that ecosystem going. We're all pretty concentrated in a pretty contained area. Anyhow.
Yeah, but that's one of the nice things about what Cengn brings to the table, right? So, and you know, just thinking of it, this is one of the reasons we're all here, right? Is Cengn actually does help promote those bridges. It's not just, a lot of the larger companies honestly won't do it on their own very easily because they're very focused on revenue, profit, and stuff like that, all the stuff that keeps their shareholders happy. But when we invest in organizations such as Cengn allows it to be a catalyst for making those bridges that you were talking about. And so, you know, we need to continue to grow Cengn, and we need to create other types of Cengns within Canada, right, that address other aspects of the market.
Okay, we have 4 minutes left, so certainly time for one more question if someone would like to ask one. Go ahead. Microphone's on the way. 2 questions from the same table. Thank you.
A lot of innovation going on there.
With the advancements in machine learning, the environment, I have to disagree with my table mate Michael here about boatloads of people. I was in California this summer and spent some time with people who are doing coding systems that code to replace programmers. They're now writing programs, basic programs, but they're advancing very quickly as machine learning is advancing. How do you see machines writing our code and our software for us affecting the industry? Is this going to be a major disruptor in the next 5 years? Anyone?
Bueller?
I don't know if it's about machines. I mean, I think that's, I'm aware of that, and it's pretty interesting. But the interesting thing, like in our world, is our NOC operators, we have 24/7 network operations center, and our NOC operators are actually training our software to do them out of a job. Of course, that ultimate goal is to scale and such. But, you know, I think to that perspective, that they're ready, the code is being written by the using of the software. And I think that's what you're going to see more and more of. And so that's why my earlier comment is that, you know, the real problems are not, it's like the Wright brothers solving, you know, finding out the airplane. They weren't the most well-funded. They weren't the ones who had all the engineers behind it and everything else. They were just someone who wanted to get this thing off the ground. And, you know, I think all the real problems are going to be in areas that, as machine learning becomes just a tool belt, that they will innovate in, you know, the police officer will innovate because he sees a problem. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure I really answered your question, but it's kind of a perspective.
I'd add as well, it's just interesting, when I first heard the question, you know, you think machines writing code, But if you had asked me maybe 5-10 years ago, not even 10 years ago, about cars driving themselves on our roads, completely autonomously, it sounded like a pipe dream.
Yeah.
And clearly, when we talk about machine learning, you often hear the comment about, you know, duplicating human intelligence. I think I saw someone recently comment, that's setting the bar too low.
Yeah.
Consider just how far you know, machines can go in the future once they really start to have the capabilities that we're slowly enabling. There will be some innovations that are unexpected, I'm sure. And so, you know, having systems generating code, I could certainly see that coming. Maybe not in necessarily the near term. They may be able to do some simple tasks, but understanding what to do, why to do it, there's still some work there.
Yeah, I understand the problem, but I'm not an expert in this field by any stretch. And you know, the only thing that I can comment on is that I'm just thinking of, you know, Kurzweil's theorem, right, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with, where basically machines will be at a level that they'll have the ability, the computational ability of the human brain by, I think they targeted about 2025, right, is where Kurzweil put it there. except the brain's not evolving, right? And computers will continue likely to follow Moore's law. So it seems inevitable that it's going to be doing things to, self-learn, self-create, and expand. But it's about as much as I'd prepared to speculate at this point in time.
Yeah, that
Give it
brings up
another
a
7
whole
years.
other level of discussion.
Yeah.
I mean, there's all sorts of directions that kind of question can go in, right?
Yeah.
From, how do the pets that are robots evolve to be friends for men or mankind, and where does that go? And certainly, all the possibilities are endless. I don't think any of us have the experience to put a timeline on it, but certainly machines learning how to code and coding certain things so it's there, and there's no reason why that wouldn't grow as well. It did take us, 25, 30 years to get from the first neural network simulators running on x86s, or at that point it was a 186, I think, that I run my first one on, to today where we've got specialized silicon for it, and we can actually do some pretty sophisticated things with it. So I have to feel that we're probably looking at a timeline, maybe not quite so long, but I don't think it's 5 years. At least I hope it's not 5 years, personally. I don't think the world's ready for that. Well, I think we're about done. So in the 15 seconds we have left, I just want to thank the panel and thank everyone for listening and the questions. And I hope we set a direction for the country that everyone can take away and work on.
Thank you.
Thanks.